Hello and welcome to the World Today. I'm going to be talking to Dick Lowe, who is Reader in Economics at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. We're going to be discussing China and especially the Chinese economy, since the reports in the global financial press about a crisis, economic crisis in China, has created panic in many parts of the world, especially the Western world, which is closely tied to China in some ways. And there are fears that a collapse or a depression in China could, of course, involve the entire world market. Now, it is important to point out that one of the most amazing developments of the 21st century has been the emergence of China as a gigantic economic powerhouse, and at a speed which is unprecedented in the history of capitalism, such long growth at such a pace. And this has essentially meant that the center of the world market has shifted eastwards, with China and, of course, other powers, lesser economic powers in that region, playing an increasingly important role. Dick, could you talk and tell us about the current crisis in the Chinese economy, which has created panic in all the financial capitals of the world, fearing they're not getting the exact figures out of China, that the Chinese government is concealing things? What exactly is going on now?
Right. I think the press reports, particularly commentaries by people with the financial establishments, might be somewhat different from what is exactly going on with the economy. It's true that the economic growth has been slowing down. I think it is still the fastest rate of growth across the world. And therefore, it is, in my view, quite an exaggeration to argue that this is something a crisis. If it is indeed a crisis, it's not by international comparison, but rather in comparison with the previous experience, and also in relation to the Chinese political economy that is domestically, which is, I think, is far more important.
But we do get reports out of China from visitors and from Chinese journalists describing traveling through parts of China with huge new towns have been built to accommodate the newly rising middle classes, but completely unoccupied.
Yeah, I think that's true. And in fact, that is well aware by the state leadership. Now, in my view, at the heart of the problem is a kind of distributive problem, meaning that the Chinese population actually is in need of all these newly built properties, housing. Bearing in mind that the rates of urbanization in China is now roughly 55%, there is still a huge proportion or a huge population in the countryside that would be willing to enter the urban areas. The property developers are unwilling to accept the loss of their investments in accommodation of these social needs. It required a redistribution of incomes in order to translate the needs into demands.
What effect would, let's say, if the Chinese economy this year and the next year goes into further fall? Of course, everything is relative, as you've correctly pointed out. But what effects will a further decline in the growth rates of the Chinese economy have, for instance, on Western markets?
On Western markets, that is not easy to tell because we need to take into account of two different considerations. One consideration is that the world economy is suffering from serious problems of insufficient demands. And in fact, a reduction in Chinese exports in this sense might be seen as something welcome. But on the other hand, we also need to know that Chinese goods are exceedingly cheap by international comparison. And therefore, reduction in Chinese exports to the developed economies might not be a welcome for the consumers in the economies.
And inside China itself, if there's a further decline, what will be the impact there?
Now, we first need to have some idea as to whether the slowdown of growth is to continue and it is to worsen in the near future and also in the more long term. The growth slowdown has been very much because of the slowdown of productive investment. The government did not take an active role to try to reverse this trend. The National People's Congress is ongoing. The session is now we are now still in the session, and it is observable that the Chinese leadership has, in a sense, a fundamental change in policy approach. Instead of talking about readjustments, talking about austerity, it's now focusing on massive expansion of government investments, particularly in infrastructure, with a view of stimulating the economy.
But there are some people, some senior economic advisors to the government, who are putting forward a view that we have to look carefully at what happened in the Thatcher-Reagan era. There was a big rise in development in the Western world by privatizations, etc., i.e. defending hardcore neoliberalism. So I assume there is some debate going on in China between the hardcore neoliberals, the less hard neoliberals, and then the section of economists who want more state intervention.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Like that, it was observable last year, a number of high-profile speeches or statements by high government officials, ministers, that emphasizing the need to push forward more fundamental market reform, claiming that this is the only way out of the crisis. The finance minister has been claiming that it is necessary to cut labor costs in order for China to move out of these difficult conditions. And the central bank governors kept arguing that it is necessary to further speed up financial liberalization, in particular to liberalize capital controls in order that China can reap the benefits of market reforms and therefore moving out of the difficult conditions. It seems to me that they had the upper hands in the internal policy decisions within the Chinese leadership. The most serious problem was the massive capital flights. Some estimates by international agencies put the figure as at least $600 billion of capital outflows that from China that have not been accounted for, and some other simple calculation put it even much bigger. And all these were very much related to those market fundamentalist statements made by some high government officials. But then, as I mentioned, it is observable that things seem to have changed since last week, that in perception of all these the serious mistakes that have been made, the government seems to have changed the policy line quite fundamentally. So that is to say that it's true that quite some sections within the Chinese political economy, including in the top level of the governments, that are very much influenced by by neoliberalism, or in fact they might be representative of the vested interests of the speculative financial interests. But that is not to say that the Chinese political economy as a whole has been fully captured or largely captured by neoliberal orientation.
But Dick, you talk about the massive outflows of capital from China. Surely one way to deal with this would be to impose capital controls.
Formally, the system of capital controls is still there. That, of course, China has liberalized many items. There are about 40 items under the capital accounts. But the most important thing, portfolio flows, China has continued to have a formal system of controls over all this. When I say the capital flights, I'm talking about in a sense, illegal or at least unapproved capital flows, right? Including the inward flows of hot money and outward flows of capital flights. The simple number of more than $600 billion of unaccounted for capital flights. Right? That is sufficient to indicate that the system was not sufficiently enforced last year. And that's why, since the sudden devaluation of the yuan earlier this year, the government has now taken a much tougher measures to enforce the system.
Let's try and get some overview of the political economy of China today. I know this is a hot subject. It's debated non-stop in China and outside China and amongst academics and others. How would you describe the Chinese economic system today? Is, in terms of capitalism, partial capitalism, state capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, etc., how would you see it today and how would you describe it?
Now, first of all, we need at least some simple conceptual understanding of what is the dominant the trends or dominant developments in the world economy, in order that we can properly assess the nature of Chinese political economy. Now, in a nutshell, I would argue that the world political economy has been very much dominated by speculative financial capital, roughly since the early 1990s, since the ejection of the yuan from the ERMs. This predominance could not have been sustainable because speculative activities tend to crowd out productive activities. But it has actually been sustained thanks to the process of globalization. That is to say, the application of neoliberal policies across the world, particularly in the developing world. One of the main sources of profits is the incorporation of China into this system, in particular the incorporation of Chinese labor to produce for the world markets. China has been at least in parts, integrated into this system of neoliberal world economy. And the extreme example is the sweatshop or the so-called world factory in southern China. And the most well-known is the company Foxconn, right, which supplies all these iPhone, iPads, Apple products for, at the time it supplies more than 80% of the Apple products to the world markets. Now, but is this the dominant part of the Chinese economy? I think it's very doubtful, right? That I would rather argue that it's just an enclave of the Chinese economy, because it is quite easily observable of several important things. First, the productive investments has been growing very fast in China for fully 30 years. And in fact, a simple figure shows that take the capital formation as a proportion of GDP. Over the past 30 years, the average rate for China is something close to 40%. Then in the rest of the developing world, it's only a half. So this is a clear indication that the Chinese economy is not or has not been dominated by speculative activities. Instead, it has been mainly a productive economy. And secondly, it is also observable that the consumption growth in China actually has been exceedingly fast, on average close to 10% in real terms for more than 30 years. And therefore, it is hard to say that this is a neoliberal economy. And then the next point, is it a capitalist economy? Now, again, it is not easy to tell. At one level, you can observe that the microeconomic agents, that is the firms, including state firms, have become very much capitalist in terms of practices. Right? That is to say, the relationship between the firms and the workers is very much marketized. And therefore, the accumulation of capital based on the creation and extraction of surplus produced by workers, that is observable. But then everything depends on the nature of the Chinese state. After all, by now, the Chinese state is still the dominant part of the Chinese political economy. So is this capital accumulation in the sense of capitalism, or is it rather still undetermined nature with the, after all, even if it is non-capitalist, it still needs to accumulate in order to survive in the ocean of system of world capitalism.
Let me stop you there and ask you, is it, of course, it's technically possible, I guess, though I'm not 100% sure, that having gone so far out, creating these enclaves, in encouraging the birth of private firms and capital in China itself, would it be possible, let's say there was a huge global crisis within the next 10 years, which of course affected China, would it be possible for the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party or the Chinese Communist or Capitalist Party to take a decision at its top levels and pull back completely and say this experiment is either over or has to be very seriously moderated and reformed, and the state is going to play a much, much bigger part, given that we have already reached this stage of capital accumulation? Could they do that technically without creating a huge crisis within the Chinese political apparatus, which you know better than me, is very closely linked now to the new capitalism, which we are seeing in China, many cases of corruption, etc.?
Now, first of all, it depends on both incentive and capability. And secondly, it also depends on, more fundamentally, the position of China in the world economy. China is one of the very few economies that has had systematic interaction with the world economy or with the system of world capitalism. We can see that the Chinese leadership has been trying to push for further expansion of going out rather than retreating to impose some kinds of delinking with the capitalist world economy. It is most unlikely that China is to move back to its pre-reform system under Mao. Instead, it wants to, in a sense, to push for the transformation of the world economy in a direction that is considered to be both feasible and desirable for China itself, And we have seen all these initiatives, right, that such as the Asian Infrastructural Investment Bank, the New Development Bank, also known as the BRICS Bank, all this on top of the fact that China has become, as I mentioned, the biggest trading economy in the world, as well as one of the biggest supplier of foreign direct investment, as well as recipient economy of inward foreign direct investments.
Effectively, you're saying that China's growth outwards, we're not talking now about the internal life in China, but the export-oriented advances made by China are such that any reversion to anything else is virtually impossible. Okay, well, that raises another point. Let us suppose, after all, we don't live simply in an economic world, we live in a political and military world, where the power of the United States is dominant. I mean, militarily, the United States are more powerful than the next 7 or 8 countries put together. And the Chinese government has till now not gone in for massive rearmament like the old Soviet Union did. It's effectively, the Chinese military expenditure still seems to me to be rather defensive to protect China, which is intelligent. But what if Chinese investments in the wake of a new crisis were threatened by military pressure from the United States and its European allies in different parts of the world? How would China cope with that? Is it inevitable that China will remain what it is, or would what is happening in China lead to the emergence of a Chinese imperialism?
Now, first of all, I fully agree that your characterization that at least up until this point, the Chinese approach to international relations is almost completely defensive rather than offensive, or rather than aggressive to move outwards, right? Aggressively moving outwards. Now, because of all these economic necessities, or the need to expand the economy overseas, would that hit the limits of following its traditional approach? Even the Chinese leadership seems to be quite uncertain as to what to do. And so far, it has to rely mainly on bilateral partnership with this or that the countries or this or that bloc of countries, and not very successful, I must say. The very important initiative is to do it through the Shanghai Cooperation the initiative, right, which is mainly the China plus Russia, right? That of course it's might be useful in terms of the near the neighbors, like say the Central Asian states, together with Pakistan, that China could have this as a protection for its economic activities. But when it extends further to the Middle East, then things are simply out of control, that China has had traditionally very little influence. Now Iran seems to be very willing to join this grouping, and that might add some help to the Chinese the initiatives.
Dick Low, can we just now return to one issue which we haven't discussed so far, which is internal life in China itself. This huge development of capitalism in its different forms in China has also created now the world's largest proletariat, to use an old-fashioned word. How long will this new Chinese proletariat, I mean, I know there are small peasant uprisings, there are workers' strikes. But how long before this proletariat becomes a power for itself and actually challenges a system which it feels is exploiting it? Because, you know, wages in China are very low, as we know, compared to the level of the global economy. And keeping a one-party state, therefore, is very important for the development of capital in China, as it was in many different parts of the world a long time ago. But how long can they maintain these state structures, given that there will be new forces from below? And if they embark on any massive repression, there is a threat then to the country, the state, and the integrity of the country.
Now, first of all, I think it would be more appropriate to say that it's a process, semi-proletarianization rather than a complete one, in the sense that the rural population, each household has a piece of land, which is the fallback versions in the case of economic difficulties. Right? And that actually has been very helpful in terms of reducing the cost of capital accumulation. What is precisely meant by capital accumulation? Is it the classical case of exploiting the workers for the sake of accumulation? Now, accumulation itself, as mentioned, is not indicative of whether it is capital or otherwise. As well, it's well known in the Soviet industrialization debate, the work of Preobrazhensky, arguing that even if it is a socialist-oriented political economy, if it is to survive in the ocean of world capitalism,
yes,
accumulation is still needed. This leads us to the third point, whether or not the general public, the ordinary people, the working people, do perceive that they have been exploited by some unknown forces. Now, objectively, it doesn't seem to be fully certain that they have been exploited. And subjectively, they have perceived this or that as unfair, but when they voiced out their complaints, they have been mostly resort to government help, and using arguing that the Chinese legal or constitutional
conciliation commissions and all that.
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly. Right. So it's definitely true that across China there have been all kinds of phenomena of exploitation, or even we can call it super exploitation, very unjustified phenomenon of exploitation. And it's also true that labor unrest has been here and there, and of increasingly much bigger scales. But it is
and also the disparity in wealth now, that China is creating billionaires. And the last figures I saw on this was that wealth disparities in China were higher than in the United States.
Well, it's possible that the distribution of wealth has been has reached such a state of extremely uneven distribution. And nevertheless, it is still the fact that the dominant part of wealth is with the hand of the state. Right? And unless we can be certain about the nature and the conduct of the state, it would not be possible to make a definite judgment whether the Chinese, whether there is, to be bluntly, class conflicts have reached a systematic scale.
Dick Low, it's been very good talking to you, and we should no doubt return to this subject because it's not going to go away. Thank you very much.
Thanks, sir.